Today we're going to be doing a tier list of every commentator currently in the UFC, or at least the relevant ones. We're also going to be including some that aren't in the UFC, but just ones that I want to bring in, like people who have been fired or people who used to be in the UFC and aren't anymore. But these are just the main commentators. Obviously, if there's been a commentator who's like commentated like 3 events or commentated only a couple of events, I'm not going to include them. I'm only going to include the main set of commentators. Starting off with Paul Felder. I'm going to put Paul Felder. I'm going to put him in S tier. I think he's a really, really, really good commentator. He's he knows what he's talking about. He's got a nice voice for commentating. He's just a really good commentator. He knows what he's talking about. Obviously, he's been a UFC fighter himself. He's been there at the top level. There's never really any bias with him either. He just does the job. Talks about the fight. I do think he could talk a little bit more. Like when I was watching Marvin Vettori versus Paulo Costa, I believe it was him, Daniel Cormier, and it was him, Michael Bisping, and John Gooden, I think. And there were times when one of the fighters were getting cracked, and he is a little bit hesitant to speak sometimes. He's not one of the main commentators. He usually only commentates fight nights, but he has got that voice for commentary. He's got that nice commentary voice, knows what he's talking about, does a good job, not much bias, really good commentator is Paul Felder. I like him as a commentator. You can't hate Paul Felder as a commentator. Yeah, he's definitely up there in one of the best commentators in the UFC. He does. The only thing I could critique him on is that sometimes, like I said, he'll be a little bit hesitant. He sometimes just goes into like little moments where he just won't say anything because he just gets too locked in at the fight. But he's a good commentator, a good person. I like Paul Felder as a commentator. And then we're gonna go with a fighter that's not fighter, a commentator and a fighter that's not in the UFC anymore, Dan Hardy. I'm going to put Dan Hardy. I'm going to put him in B tier. He was always a good commentator, was Dan Hardy. His breakdowns, and he still does it on YouTube, his breakdowns of the fights were so good. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew previous fighter history. He could break down moves so well because he's been a fighter himself as well. Didn't have much bias. Sometimes he'd have a little bit of bias, but it wasn't like to the point where you'd have to turn your TV on. I feel like he got a little bit too emotional. I mean, that's kind of the reason why he doesn't commentate anymore, because he got really angry at Herb Dean. But he was really good at commentary. He broke things down perfectly. Like I said, if he'd have done more events, and I don't know, man, it just feels like his voice isn't the best for commentary, though. That's one of the things. I don't know, you hear his voice and it's not like the iconic commentary voice. Like if a crowd's going wild and there's like an absolute war going on, you can't really, like Dan Hardy's not really the person for that, because you're trying to watch an absolute scrap and this guy's talking about every single leg kick that gets thrown and why it got thrown and why they decided to throw it. So I feel like he's only good in like boring fights or technical fights. When it's an absolute war or scrap, I feel like he can be quite useless. He's got a really squeaky voice as well, so whenever there's like a flash knockout, your ears just get overloaded with his scream. But he's a decent commentator, knows how to break down fights, but could do better in the sense that, I don't know, he doesn't fit well. I feel like he's a good commentator depending on what the fight is. Like he's more of a fight night commentator. Then we move on. Dominick Cruz. I'm going to put Dominick Cruz in A tier. I'm going to put him in A tier. Like I said, there's not much bias with Dominick Cruz. He's got a bit of a quiet voice for commentary. It would be good if he was louder, but he definitely knows what he's talking about. Like I don't want to say that for everything, but like the other two, he's been a fighter himself. Not much bias, and there'll be times where he can, like Dan Hardy, break things down really well. He knows a lot about wrestling and striking. He's just a really good commentator to have on commentary. There's never a time when I'm like, Dominick Cruz is doing terrible or Dominick Cruz has said something bad. Like I said, the only critiques are he has got a bit of a quieter voice, but he says the right things at the right times, never really has any problems or issues or problematic things in commentary, just gets the job done. Like I said, because of his quiet voice and because he's not like a massive standout commentator, he can't be with Paul Felder at S tier. Not much bias with him. He's a good commentator, a really solid commentator. I'll put him at A tier. I'll put him at A tier. Then we're gonna go with, sorry about the mic. Then we're gonna go with Michael Bisping. I'm going to put Bisping in C tier. I'm not a fan of Bisping, to be honest, on the commentary. He should do well. He's been a fighter in the past. It's kind of like Bisping. He's very biased a lot of the time. Like, for example, if there's a British fighter or there's a fighter that's fighting that he wants to win, he will show signs of bias. A lot of the time he'll just lose like track of what he's saying. So the fight will start, and for the first minute he'll have good commentary, and then he'll just get bored of the fight and start talking about random things. Like, if you're a deaf person and you can't hear anything and you've got Bisping on commentary, you're useless, because he talks about really irrelevant things. I feel like he'll talk about things that just aren't relevant with a fight, like alliterations in that one fight he did, and talking about where he's going to be, and talking about when he was a fighter I did this, blah blah blah. He's got a good voice for commentary, I guess. He's kind of like the replacement for Joe Rogan. He's there at a lot of events. He's got a very recognisable voice. It's just, again, he just seems like a casual commentator. He talks a lot about the background of fighters and everything but the actual fight. It's like he's like a Siri that tells you information about the fighters, but he never really talks about the fight. He never breaks down what's going in the fight. Rarely ever talks about like when a big shot gets landed. Shows a lot of emotion as well. Shows that, yeah, he talks over people. He's just not the best commentator in my opinion. He could definitely do a lot of improvements. Like, he'll just lose track of what he's saying. Like, oh, I went up Pendle Hill the other day. I really did. I don't know, man. I don't know how to say it. He's just not a great commentator. He loses track of what he's saying a lot. Does have quite a bit of bias whenever there's a fighter he wants to win. Doesn't really analyse fights like a commentator should. Like, just imagine yourself, if you put not deaf person, I mean. Did I say it? I mean a blind person, not a deaf person. So if you were a deaf person and you were watching UFC, would Bisping help you walk you through the fight? He wouldn't. All the other commentators mainly would. Bisping wouldn't. So I'm going to put him at C tier. Then we're going to go Brendan Fitzgerald. I'm going to put him at B tier. Yeah, I'm going to put him at B tier. Brendan Fitzgerald, there's nothing really good about him, but there's nothing really bad about him. He's in the middle. He's never really got any problematic takes. He talks at the right times. Nice commentary voice as well. Doesn't really show up to too many events. Doesn't really sound like he knows what he's talking about like other commentators do. He just sounds like it's like he's talking about, like, I don't know, like he just says very basic things in the fight, is what I'm saying. He likes to say very basic things that we all already know. He's just kind of there. Like, he doesn't really add to the commentary, is what I'm saying. Like, he's a good addition. Like, I'd rather have him than like maybe Bisping or someone else at the lower levels. But he doesn't add much. Like, you're never there celebrating because Brendan Fitzgerald is on commentary. Do you know what I mean? He's in the middle. He's a good commentator, but he's not a great commentator. Can't really break anything down like Dan Hardy. Doesn't have the knowledge like Dominick, Cruz or Felder. But he's a decent commentator. If you're in need of one, just place him in there, and no one will recognise him. Then we're gonna go with one that's again no longer in the UFC. Mike Goldberg. I'm going to put him at the top of A tier. He was a really good commentator. Him and Joe Rogan back in the day was such a good commentary duo. He was a great commentator, man. He was a great commentator. That he had one of the most iconic commentary voices in history. Whenever a fight started, here we go. Or when someone got knocked out, it is all over, just like that. John Jones. Great fucking commentary voice he had. He was so good on commentary, man. And he actually had decent. He didn't really talk much during the fight. It would kind of be him having a conversation with Joe Rogan, which is why he's not S tier. Had good understanding of the fight. Had good background of the fighters. Kind of had a casual way of how he talked. Like, he didn't really talk anything like mind blowing. If it was kind of like a casual way he talked. Like, he talked like, how do I say it? Like, he didn't really say anything extraordinary on commentary. He'd say very basic things on commentary that you expect a casual to say, but he had such a good voice for it. He had so many iconic lines. Honestly, I kind of miss him on commentary, and just because of that, you've got to put him at A tier. Like Dan Hardy, he was good on commentary, but I don't necessarily miss him. Mike Goldberg, bro, he was such a good commentator back in the day. He was like the voice of commentary. And then Joe Rogan took over for a little bit and then went on a downfall. But Mike Goldberg, solid A tier. Then we're going to go with Jon Anik. Honestly, I think Jon Anik is the greatest commentator in the UFC. He is the best commentator in the UFC. He's got the best voice for sponsorships. You know, talking about Modelo. He said a lot of funny things. You know, that thing about like fighter having custody battles and Amanda Nunes and eggs and stuff. He's humorous. He's got such a good voice for commentary. I think he's got one of the best, if not the best voice for commentary. The way he talks, he's got such a good reaction to like when something happens, like a big shot gets landed, or you know someone gets slammed or knocked out cold or submitted. He's got a good reaction. He's probably got some of the best commentary reactions we've ever seen. He's got just a natural voice for commentary. He does it so well. It was like he's always meant to be a commentator. You never really see him doing breakdowns in the fight like a Daniel Cormier would, or a Joe Rogan would, or you know, a Dan Hardy. It seems like he knows what he's talking about, but he doesn't really say much during the fight of actual breaking down. He kind of just says background information, but because of his voice and because of how well and his reactions, and he's unbiased as well. Jon Anik is never really biased as well. I've never thought of any time where Jon Anik has any bias around him, so he is the best commentator in the UFC. Whenever Jon Anik's not on commentary, it's always a bit weird. It feels like it's a bit out of control. It's like a bit messy without Jon Anik. He is the stable number one commentator in the UFC. Then we're going to go with Daniel Cormier. I'm going to put Daniel Cormier at the top of C tier. I'll put him at the top of C tier. He's better than Bisping because he definitely knows what he's talking about. Definitely knows what he's talking about. Especially with the wrestling. Whenever there's any form of grappling or wrestling, the first voice you'll ever hear is Daniel Cormier waffling about wrestling. And on the feet, he's got a good voice for commentary as well. I know I've said that about pretty much everyone. He's got a good voice for commentary. Likes to engage with other commentators as well, so it's not just him waffling for ages. He kind of likes to directly talk to commentators as well. Like instead of just saying a sentence, he'll say like Joe, like he's talking to Joe, or he'll say John like he's talking to John. His bias is weird. It feels like, I mean, he's definitely got bias. That's the problem. He's definitely got some of the most bias on commentary. If not, I think he might have some of the most bias out of every commentator, especially when it's to do with like Russians and Dagestanis and Khabib and people he likes, like Adesanya. He'll have a lot of bias towards them. But when it's fighters like John Jones, he won't really say much. His reaction to finishes are very lackluster as well. Like there could have been an absolutely huge knockout, one of the biggest in the UFC, and he'd kind of like just pull a sad face. He doesn't really have any reaction to finishes at all. Which is why he's so low. But I guess he's good at breaking down grappling. He's alright when there's no Joe Rogan. Like, if it's him, and let's say Brendan Fitzgerald, he'll be good. But if it's him, Bisping and Rogan, he kind of goes down a level. So I'm going to have to put him at C tier. Then we've got Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, for me, is in the middle of B tier. Back in the day, he was a lot better than he is now. Put it that way. Back in the day, he was a lot better. He understood fighters. He was the perfect mix with Mike Goldberg. He kind of like Bisping. He kind of just goes off a lot. Like he'll kind of talk about random things like the cups that fighters made, or the history of a martial art, or like for example, what was it? Paulo Costa versus Yoel Romero, I think it was. Yoel Romero was like teeing off on Paulo Costa, or it might have been the other way around. And then instead of actually talking about the fight itself, he was kind of just talking about how Paulo Costa has been training Taekwondo recently, as if that adds any relevance to the fight. He knows a lot of history of the fighters. He's a bit of a casual as well, though. Like it's like if it's not like a main card fighter, like on the early prelims, it's like he's only just seen the fight for the first time. He doesn't really know much fighters on the early prelims. Seems like he doesn't really want to commentate anymore as well. But I've got to give it to him. His post-fight interviews are the best out of everyone. His what's it called? His breakdowns of the fight are really good as well. He knows a lot about breaking down of the fights because he's a trained martial artist as well. I think he's like a black belt in jiu-jitsu and like he does taekwondo. He's good at taekwondo. Good voice for commentary as well, very clear. I know I've said that about every single commentator so far, but he's a natural at commentary. He's been doing it for so long as well, so he's got the experience, he's got the IQ. He has got a lot of bias though, like when it's Adesanya versus Blachowicz, he had a lot of bias there. He carries a lot of bias into fights, which is why he's not at A tier or S tier, but he's a good commentator, a stable commentator, doesn't let it get out of control. He has a very clear point. He won't let anyone say waffling stuff. He'll correct someone immediately. He's got a good voice commentary. Yeah. B for Joe Rogan. Finally, we're going to put John Gooden. I'm going to put him in D tier. If you don't know John Gooden, he's kind of like a British commentator. He only usually commentates like British events or a one-off event somewhere. He's got a pretty bad voice for commentary. Kind of talks like he's a casual. Doesn't really ever add much to commentary. It's kind of like you've just got some random presenter giving him a microphone and he's got to analyse what he's seeing. Not a great commentator. I believe he is a martial artist in some way, not an MMA fighter, but I think he's like does wrestling or jiu-jitsu. But he's not a great commentator. Kind of just talks like a casual. Has a bunch of bias towards English fighters as well. Yeah, I'll put him at D tier. But that is my tier list. We got Jon Anik and Paul Felder at S tier. Mark Goldberg and Dominick Cruz at A tier. Dan Hardy, Joe Rogan and Brendan Fitzgerald at B tier. Daniel Cormier and Bisping at C tier. And at D tier we have John Gooden. Please tell me if you agree with any of them.